Where we have been walking through the books of the Bible. We began in Genesis. We're not going to stop till we're in Revelation. And we are understanding and we are looking at what God is saying to us, revealing to us about himself. That's what the Bible does. It's God's revelation of himself. But it also includes the way that he includes us in his plan. And so welcome back to that. Welcome our Sapulpa, our Coweta campuses. Thank you, those of you that are watching online. We left off last week with the book of Ruth, just a little 4-chapter book that tells this beautiful love story. And the takeaway, what we learned from that is to put yourself in a position to let God work, to put yourself in a place where God can work, because it's possible that you can remove yourself from where God is working. As we read through the story, there were multiple characters, Orpah being one, an unnamed kinsman being one, a guy named Elimelech was one. They all removed themselves from where God could work in their life, but there were multiple people, including Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, who put themselves in a place to let God work. So we're going to be in 1st and 2nd Samuel today. 1st Samuel gives us a little bit of the picture of what happens after Judges. It includes Israel's last judge and the story of Samuel. It also includes the story of the first king of Israel. His name was Saul. And when we get into 2nd Samuel, it gives us the history of the kingdom of Israel's second king. His name was David. And we're going to look at them all together. You may be asking, why are we doing them together? Part of it is just to kind of lump some books together so that we can cover things efficiently throughout the year. But also, this particular combination, these two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, were originally written as one book. But when scholars translated them into the Greek language about 100 years before Jesus came along, they split it into two different books so it could be, so it would fit on regular size scrolls. So 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally written as one piece. We don't know exactly when. We suspect it was written sometime during Solomon's days and written looking back as kind of a historical narrative. 1 Samuel begins with the story of young Samuel. He was born to a mother who was desperate to have a child. Her name was Hannah, and when she has this baby, she dedicates Samuel to the work of the Lord. And God is going to speak to this boy. In fact, we'll read that, or we read that story when in just the first couple of chapters. And what we find is that Samuel has a heart for God, that Samuel puts himself in a place where he can hear from God, and God speaks to him. He lives in the tabernacle along with the high priest Eli, and he begins this life of service to God. And God has a message early on for young Samuel. One night he tells him that he was going to bring disaster on Israel and the house of Eli. Eli was the high priest. His two sons were living in sin, not living as they should. And that's exactly what's going to begin to take place beginning in about chapter 4. In fact, there's going to be a crushing defeat that takes place for Israel. And it tells us that the Israelites, they went and got the Ark of the Covenant. You remember the Ark is where they had the 10 Commandments stored. They went and got the Ark of the Covenant to use as kind of their special weapon against their enemy. It was an attempt to kind of manipulate and control God's power, but it backfired on them. And not only do they lose, but the Ark of the Covenant is captured because God doesn't honor the way they were working. God doesn't honor those kinds of things. In fact, it gives us a warning to us of trying to manipulate God and to use him as like a good luck charm, to use the things of God to benefit us and to accomplish our plans. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, not only that, when Eli, the high priest, hears about the Ark of the Covenant being taken, we're told that he falls backward off his chair and he dies. And in one day, the nation of Israel lost its high priest and lost its most sacred most sacred object. The ark is eventually going to be recovered after the Philistines put it in a pagan temple, and then they have to deal with plague after plague, moving it around from town after town. They finally said, we don't want it anymore. We're not going to deal with it. And we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 15, that Samuel continued as Israel's leader, or maybe it says judge in your version, all the days of his life. Samuel was a good man. Samuel was a good prophet. He was a good judge. He was a good leader. His sons, not so much, but Samuel was a good man. When he got old, though, the people said, we want a king. We want a king to rule us. Samuel tried to warn them. He prayed to God about it. He tried to warn them. This is what a king's going to do. He's going to tax you. He's going to make your sons go off into military, into battle. That's what a king is going to do. But the people wouldn't have anything to do with that. The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. You see, it wasn't so much that they wanted a king, because God was going to use the king and the whole kingdom process for what he's trying to accomplish. It wasn't so much their desire for a king that it was wrong. It was that they wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted to have a person out front other than God. They wanted to have a physical figure. Instead of being distinct like God had called them to be, they just wanted to look like everybody else. They wanted to be like everyone else. And instead of God being their king, they wanted to just look like all the other nations. Again, a reminder for us of taking shortcuts, the warning for us of trying to be like the people around us. So you get to chapter 9, and God is going to point out Saul, King Saul, as their first king. And in chapter 10, Samuel is going to anoint him as the king over Israel by pouring oil over Saul's head. And everything's going to begin well. There's going to be a great battle. Saul is going to kind of rally the troops and rally the forces. Good things are going to happen, but it's not too long before the power and the pressure prove too much for him. In fact, he's going to make really 3 grave mistakes. You get to 1 Samuel chapter 13, 14, and 15. One in each of those chapters. Chapter 13, Saul is going to unwisely choose to offer a sacrifice to God instead of waiting for God's man Samuel to come. He's the one that was appointed to do that. And Saul says, I'm not going to wait on him. I'm going to do it myself. Get to chapter 14. Saul is going to make a very rash vow that has to do with his own son Jonathan, and it's going to be a vow that he cannot keep, and it's going to make him look bad. You get to chapter 15, and this is going to be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Saul is going to disobey God openly when he is instructed to do something else. Basically, King Saul is going to keep some of the spoils of war, and then not only does he disobey God in that, he openly lies about it. Samuel is going to catch Saul in this lie, and Samuel then is going to make that comment or make that speech to him that says, to obey is better than sacrifice. In fact, we've talked since the very beginning about God's desire for our obedience. That's what God wants from us. From the beginning, God has desired that his people be obedient to him. We even talked about it in one week, that obedience is God's love language. And so through Samuel, he's going to tell Saul, listen, more than your sacrifices, more than the things that you're doing to honor me, more than your worship processes and your religious practices, really what I want from my people is obedience. And obviously Saul is not going to do that, and so God rejects Saul as king. You get to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and a young boy named David enters the story. Because the majority of the contents of the rest of 1 Samuel and almost the entirety of 2 Samuel revolve around the life of David, we're going to focus the remainder of our time on him today. Here's what I love about David's life. It reminds us that God is on a mission, that God is doing something, that God is up to something in this world, that God is working behind the scenes, that God is on mission. He's doing something, and he uses those of us who make ourselves available to him to accomplish that mission. That's exactly what David does. He makes himself available, and maybe just like David, God is asking you to partner with him, along with him, on his mission. Chapter 16 starts the story telling us about David, who is about a freshman in high school, maybe 15 years old. He's watching sheep. He's just passing time. He's singing and writing music. He's target practicing with his sling. He was known for that. And the prophet Samuel now, an old man, is going to come to his father's house, and he knows that he's there to anoint the next king. In fact, Samuel knows that's why he's there, but he doesn't know which son out of 7 that he is to anoint as king. He assumes it's the oldest of them. In fact, we get to chapter 16, verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab, the oldest of David's brothers, and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands before the Lord. That would have been normal to think it was the eldest of the boys, but it's not. The Lord said to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. Just a reminder for us of what's most important to God. See, Jesse is going to call all the brothers in one by one, but he doesn't even call in David. He has 7 older brothers who are more qualified, but finally we get down to verse 10, and after 7 of his sons passed before Samuel, Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep, Samuel said. Send for him. So at this point, he's not even in the run. He's just, I like that word, the youngest. Literally, what that reads right there is he is the runt of the litter. He hasn't even been brought in yet. So they sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health, had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said to Samuel, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. Anointed him now, like at probably 15 years old, as the king of Israel. There was a special process that took place. There was something that was special when they would put that oil on their head. It set them apart. It was very special. The anointed one. And that's going to tell us something more as we look to the anointed one in the future, just a little bit later on. It wasn't anyone that they expected. I mean, they'd gone through 7 brothers before they even got to David. He was such a departure from the norm, but what that teaches us is that God can use anybody. God can use anybody that he wants to use. In fact, it's oftentimes those that we wouldn't expect. The young, the inexperienced. It's just a shepherd. And shepherding is what you sent the kids to do. God can use anybody. Well, we hear that. It's easy for us to agree mentally with that, but it's sure easy for us to come up with excuses of why he can't use us. I know God can use anybody, but in my particular case, I'm too old. Remember, that was a little bit of the excuse that Abraham and Sarah said when God said, you're going to have a son, and that son is going to bless the nations. And they said, no, we're too old, but God used them. Or maybe it was like Rahab the prostitute that helped the spies in the city of Jericho, and her excuse could have been, I'm too guilty, I've got too much baggage, I've got too much history, but God used her. Or maybe I'm too afraid. That was the judge Gideon. He was hiding out. God said, I'm going to have you lead my people against the Midianites, and he could have easily said, I'm too afraid. In fact, he practically did, but God came through and used him. And it continues throughout the Bible. You get into the New Testament, and there's a little teenage girl named Mary that God is going to use. And there's a tax collector named Matthew. And then there's just an ordinary fisherman named Peter. And yet God is going to use anyone that he wants to use. While Saul, the first king, was tall, powerful, presidential, David wasn't an expected choice. Wasn't what anybody expected. He wasn't firstborn. He wasn't well known. He wasn't even of age. He was just a shepherd, just a boy. But God saw potential in David that hardly anyone else saw. In fact, they didn't even see this choice coming. Look what the New Testament tells us about this choice. Acts 13:22, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Saul, on one hand, was almost committed. Saul almost fully obeyed. But the Bible tells us that David was all in, that David would fully obey. In fact, it's going to show up in the next couple of chapters that we read, because God can use anybody, and we'll see that he can use anybody to do anything. God can use anybody to do anything. So after King David, after David is anointed king, what does he do? Take up residence in a palace? No. Start touring the area and developing a following? No. He goes back to watching sheep, goes back to slinging rocks, goes back to singing songs. It's a little bit of an awkward time because Saul is still the king, but David knows he's going to be the next king, and in the meantime, he's just a shepherd. Maybe sitting around watching the sheep wondering when it's going to happen, when's God going to do something, what's next, how's this going to work out? We get to chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. Maybe David's about 18 years of age, and his father calls him in from the fields. He's been out watching the sheep. He says, I want you to check on the brothers. They're out fighting on the front lines of battle. I want you to take them some food. And so David makes the journey, but when he arrives, there's no fighting on the front battle lines. In fact, there is one person out in the valley from the enemy, and this is a giant named Goliath. And he has challenged anyone who would take him up on the Israelite side of the line to a battle, to a duel. He says, choose a man who will come out and fight with me. Chapter 17, verse 11 says, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. In other words, there wasn't anybody that was going to go out and take this giant up on his challenge. There wasn't anybody going to do that. They were all dismayed and terrified, including the king of Israel. David asked the men, verse 26, standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Or maybe the bigger question, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And ultimately what David is going to do is go and volunteer and say, I'll go fight him. I'll do it. I'll take up the challenge. King Saul is going to say, you're only a boy, you're just a shepherd. Maybe very personally, King Saul is saying, you're my harpist, you're my musician. No, you can't go. But when he insists, he says, well, at least wear my armor. And David's going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And he takes his staff and his sling, and he's going to go meet this Goliath. You know, it's possible that David thought while he was watching sheep, he was just wasting time in the fields. He's just wasting time. All those times he just target practicing, or that time that he, killed the wild animal that was trying to grab one of his sheep. He'd taken a rock in his sling and had taken care of the problem. Maybe all those times David just thought, I'm just wasting my time. Why isn't God using me? Why isn't God doing something? But David didn't know that he was being trained at the time he was a shepherd. God was at work, and God was doing something through that time. And the truth is, you may be in a season like that where you may not know what God is preparing for you and your future. You may not know that God has you practicing right now, preparing you for something, because God doesn't waste opportunities. We don't always see how God is doing that, but God doesn't waste opportunities. He uses what you're going through now for His good and for His glory to accomplish His mission. And so David is going to go out to meet Goliath, and he is going to stop at a stream, and he's going to pick up 5 smooth stones. I've always wondered, why did he pick 5? It was a part of a song that I sang when I was a kid. It's part of what I read. Why 5? Did he not trust God? Was he bringing backup, just in case he missed the first time? Why 5? Well, I don't know. We find out later that Goliath does have 4 brothers, and maybe, just maybe, David was getting ready for the next 4 giants after Goliath to have to do away with them. Regardless, before he goes out, or as he's going out, Goliath says to him, "What, you come after me like a dog with a stick? I am going to feed your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." I love David's response. He says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Those are big words for a teenager. But David believed, David trusted God, because David really didn't limit God. He didn't put God in a box. God, for him, didn't have to fit certain specifications. Saul was scared, dismayed, and terrified. We read it. He was concerned about the what ifs. What if I go out and I don't win? What if? And that's what happens when you think of God in a small way. The what ifs dominate your thinking. The what if someone laughs at me? What if I get a door slammed in my face? What if I look silly? What if it's somebody I know? But God through David, he didn't see the what ifs of the situation. He sees the who is of the situation. This for him wasn't David versus Goliath. This was God versus Goliath. You know, we have seen God give our church a mission. It's helping others follow Jesus. The good news for us is that the results are not up to us. This is not just our battle. This is God's battle. And like this scene that we just read, God is looking for willing participants, people who trust him to be involved, people who just believe that God can do something and go and be a part of it. Saul in the story says, "It can't be done. You're only a boy." That's when you have a small picture of God, that's what we think. It can't happen. It can't be done. It's impossible. But David operated in a different fashion with a different perspective of who God is and how big God is. You know, maybe the way that we're most likely to sell God short has to do with God's timing. See, we want God to operate on our timetable. Sometimes while we may not say the words, we might say something like, "We believe you can, but here's how much time, God, you have to work. I know you can do this, but I need you to do it in this amount of time." We saw that David was anointed king. He was just, a young teenager when that happened. But you realize that it is going to be some 15 years before he actually becomes king. Can you imagine the second guessing that you would have? Can you imagine questioning God? God, I thought this was going to happen. God, I thought you were going to do this. God, did I understand this wrong? Did I misinterpret something? Did I dream something? 15 years, that's going to be the case with David. 10 years of that, David is going to be on the run, actually hunted by King Saul. King Saul is going to lose the Spirit of God. He's going to get angry, and he's going to get possessive, and he's going to start chasing David down, hunting him down. So David's often hiding in caves. He's waiting, and he had opportunity to do something. In fact, there were at least a couple of times that David had opportunity to kill King Saul. But David refused to do that. He didn't do that. He had opportunity, but he didn't. And often when we sell God short, often when we put God in our little box, we think we've got to do something. We think we've got to be the ones that make this happen. We've got to be the ones that get something going here. But not the case with David. In fact, 2 Samuel 5:4, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. Just to go back to our point here, God can use anybody to do anything at any time. See, he operates on his time schedule. God makes things happen according to His calendar, not anyone else, and certainly not before. I like the way Dylan Burrows wrote it. He said, God is never late and rarely early. He is always exactly right on time, His time. God is never late. Feels like it sometime. He's rarely early. We wish that would have happened sooner. But He is always exactly right on time, His time. And so sometimes we wait. Sometimes we're in that period of waiting where it doesn't seem like anything's happening and God has promised something or we're praying for something and it just seems like nothing is happening. And maybe that's happening to you right now. You're praying for someone to follow Jesus. You're praying for a family member. You're praying for a neighbor. You're praying for a coworker. You're praying for opportunities that you'll have to talk with someone. And it just seems like nothing's happening, nothing's developing, nothing's working. And maybe you're asking yourself, God, why isn't something happening? Maybe you're asking God, why aren't you doing something? But God can do anything, use anybody to do anything in His time. We're told that David was a man after God's own heart. And God promised to make his name great, to give him rest from his enemies, and to establish his throne forever. And that's exactly what happened. 2 Samuel 8:6, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. In fact, what's going to happen for David during this time is he's going to secure the border of Israel on all sides. The promised land, when he takes office, was 40 miles wide and 180 miles long. But during David's reign, the promised land is going to be expanded to some 100 miles wide by 350 miles long. It was the golden age of Israel. God is going to use a guy named David to do some pretty amazing things, but He's going to do it in His time frame. Unfortunately, as we get a little further into 2 Samuel, we're going to record some of David's sin. We don't have time to talk about it today, but we see a man who was deeply flawed, yet God's still going to use him. A man who was deeply flawed, but whose faith and trust were deeply rooted in the grace of God. Because David believed that God could use anybody to do anything at any time. A.W. Tozier said the basic trouble with the church today is her unworthy concept of God. In other words, we don't give God enough credit. We don't believe what God is capable of. We have an unworthy concept of God. Our God is too small. And so the church can be guilty of thinking, well, maybe God can't use anybody anymore, or God can't do anything anymore. Maybe God doesn't work like He used to work. And listen, if your God is about playing it safe all the time, then your God is too small. It's an unworthy concept. If your God is all about just fulfilling your wishes and making your life easier and more comfortable, then your God is way too small. If your God works only on your calendar, only when you're available, only during your time frames, your God is too small. If your God is concerned only about people who look and talk and dress and live like you, your God's too small. If your God never asks you to do anything that's not in the budget, or is not planned out in some way, then your God's too small. If your God needs certain political parties in power to work, then your God is too small. If your God is Baptist or Methodist, or you fill in whatever blank you think, then your God is too small. If your God says you're too young, or you're too old, or you're too messed up, or you're too late, or you're too poor, well, then your God is too small. If your God fits nicely into some box that you're holding on to this image, then that's not God. Because the God we read about in the books of Samuel, the God that we read about in the Bible, is a God who can use anybody to do anything at any time. Pray with me. And God, we certainly need that reminder today. We need to be reminded that you have no limits, that the only restraint is what you put upon yourself. And Father, we are grateful that we serve that kind of God, and we are guilty. Please forgive us when we have tried to put you into a box. Father, would you remind us? Would you help us to live like you can use anybody to do anything at any time? We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.